also a greater feeling of romance. People danced cheek to cheek in dark corners in nightclubs, moving to romantic music.
Teenagers in those days were much more worried about acne and prom dates than about AIDS or drugs. Barbie doll sales were higher than ever. Little girls grew up wanting to be just like Barbie.
A little pretending and a girl can make just about anything happen.
Step lightly. Step smartly.
Sex sold everything from cars to TVs, and women were sex objects. But Playboy still airbrushed its centerfold photographs. And films such as Irma la Douce, which seemed so racy at the time, but not now.
Hello, Uncle. Looking for a little fun?
There was a double standard. Men could do almost anything they wanted to, but women, well, they risked their reputations at every turn. There was also a glaring double standard for women who worked. Despite our image of the male breadwinner, 1/3 of all American women worked outside the home. Esther Peterson was an assistant secretary of labor in the Kennedy administration. She helped pass the equal pay bill for women in 1963.
And the woman was getting less because they said a man is worth more. Well, how do you measure worth?
Harry Truman once said there are 14 or 15 million Americans who have the resources to have representatives in Washington to protect their interests. And that the interests of the great mass of the other people, the 150 or 60 million, is the responsibility of the President of the United States, and I propose to fulfill it.
Kennedy seldom missed an opportunity to mingle with voters. That day in November was no exception. As a result, the motorcade to downtown Dallas didn't get underway until 11:55 in the morning. Policeman Bobby Hargis remembers the scene.
Well, the crowds were so big that they would fill the street up, and they would have to park, the crowd would have to park, let the motorcade and us through.
On the 6th floor of the book depository, Lee Oswald had shifted boxes to create a sniper's nest. Despite these friendly crowds, some in the presidential party were apprehensive about the Dallas trip. Just a few weeks earlier, United Nations Ambassador Adlai Stevenson had been struck with a sign and spit on by a crowd of Dallas conservatives. Recently, a pamphlet accusing JFK of treason had been distributed in Dallas. The day the president arrived, a full-page newspaper ad appeared, attacking his foreign policy as left-wing. Today, the idea that John F. Kennedy's foreign policy was somehow left-wing is laughable. Like Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, he was convinced the spread of communist influence was a direct threat to the United States, and John Kennedy was determined to stop it. However, he got off to a rocky beginning when a plan to overthrow Fidel Castro with an invasion by Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs failed miserably. The plan was inherited from the Eisenhower administration. The CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended it.
Of course, the Bay of Pigs hurt him, angered him, because he realized that he had relied on experts, and as he said to me, I didn't get here relying on experts. I haven't done that before. I was stupid to do that. And that was the lowest moment of all.
That summer, his meeting with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev ended in disagreement. In August 1961, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall. There was tension, but no war. JFK sensed that the real challenge was elsewhere.
The great battleground for the defense and expansion of freedom today is the whole southern half of the globe, Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East.
For Kennedy, South Vietnam had become a major problem. To defeat the communist insurgency there, he sent American helicopters and thousands of additional military advisors. The Pentagon continued to tell the president that our side was winning. American journalists on the scene were reporting just the opposite. One of them was the New York Times man in Saigon, David Halberstam.
Well, JFK got mad at David Halberstam and made the mistake of trying to influence this publisher, and that just made the Times more stubborn, so that was a mistake.
I think he was heading to a first-class
foreign policy failure, and I think he began to sense it. And in a situation like that, since everything else was going well for him in 1963, and everybody else was, so to speak, on the team, this one group that wasn't was this small group in Vietnam, and there was a quite systematic attempt, we didn't have great reputations then, to undermine our credibility, and it was very systematic, and it was not very pleasant.
25 years later, there still is disagreement over what the course of events in Vietnam might have been if Kennedy had lived. Some of his admirers, as you know, say, well, he would have gotten out of it.
Sure, and it's very easy to project one's conclusions onto a dead man. I think that's a mistake. I myself believe that he hadn't decided.
But when Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba, Kennedy was able to make a quick decision.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Kennedy confronted the Soviets with a dramatic display of toughness mixed with patience. The Soviet missiles were removed from Cuba. The young president's reputation as a world statesman soared. Berlin, June 1963.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
He was already admired in most of Latin America for his effort to create an alliance for progress to solve the massive social problems of that hemisphere.
This journey to Costa Rica has illuminated the minds of 180 million people of what a great opportunity and privilege we have to be associated together in our common cause.
And Kennedy had tapped into the mainstream of idealism in young America by deploying the Peace Corps into third world countries. Those were all works in progress. His most significant achievement was a treaty with the Soviet Union, which banned atmosphere testing of nuclear weapons.
Let us, if we can, step back from the shadows of war and seek out the way of peace. And if that journey is 1,000 miles or even more, let history record that we, in this land, at this time, took the first step.
Shortly before 12:30 p.m., the presidential motorcade reached Dealey Plaza, within view of the school book depository. The crowds were thinner here.
I jumped out into the street and I yelled, "Hey, Mr. President, look this way. We want to take your picture."
It sounded like a firecracker to me, and I thought, oh, Lord, you let it be a firecracker. And it looked like the president was bending over forward, and then when he raised back up is when that second shot hit him in the head.
I know I did a lot of praying between the bullet that wounded him and the one that killed him.
In a matter of seconds, the presidential limousine was racing toward Parkland Hospital.
When I lifted him out of the car with Clint Hill of the Secret Service and Roy Kellerman, his eyes were open, and I remember saying something like, "My God, Jack, what did they do?"
At the hospital, the president was wheeled into Trauma Room 1. An operating room was being prepared upstairs, but that massive bullet wound to the head had already made this a hopeless case. Outside, there was pandemonium, rumors of hope, then despair. Mac Kilduff, the assistant presidential press secretary, assembled the press for the official announcement.
White House press secretary Malcolm Kilduff has just announced that President Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time, which is about 35 minutes ago,